Hello, everyone, and welcome to another session of the Cooperation Tulsa Organizer Education Group. We are going to be continuing our reading of Full Spectrum Resistance, Volume 1 by Eric McBay. Appreciate you all joining me. I assume anybody who's hearing this part of the stream is probably hearing it on the recording, but if you just so happen to have already showed up, I appreciate you being here. Before we get started, I'm going to drop this link in a couple places.
Are you sure we're live? On my YouTube, I say that it's scheduled.
Scheduled, huh? It tells me that we're live.
Okay, now it is.
Okay. There we go. Putting the link in places. Success. All right. So we already got our reading order. Looks like last time we ended at this part that says, earlier in this book, I used Piven and Cloward's book, Poor People's Movements, which is peculiar because it looks like we stopped right before the section when we had to read a couple more paragraphs, but that's fine. I will get us started. Earlier in this book, I used Piven and Cloward's book, Poor People's Movements, to underscore the necessity of disruptive action. I asked John Clark, a lead organizer and founder of the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty, how his decades of grassroots anti-poverty work informed his perspective of that book. He told me, quote, Piven and Cloward articulated the position of disruptive action. That's their great strength. And in their assessment of the National Welfare Rights Organization, they, I think very rightly, condemn them for their lobbying approach, their elitism. That's all true. End quote. But John Clark also says that organizing and mobilizing can't be limited to a rare moment every few decades. Quote, even at a time that isn't one of decisive upsurge, there's still a great deal of organizing work that can be done. And organizations can still do important work when they come short of organization in the context of a massive social explosion. End quote. Here, the section heading is The Tyranny of Structurelessness. The tension between organization and amorphous spontaneity is not new. Feminist organizer Jo Freeman took it on in her classic 1970 piece, The Tyranny of Structurelessness. She discussed the origins of the women's liberation movement in rap groups, consciousness-raising meetings where women could talk through their problems and develop their political analysis together. Freeman wrote, the structureless rap group was an excellent means to this end. Its looseness and informality encouraged participation in discussion, and the often supportive atmosphere elicited personal insight. If nothing more concrete than personal insight ever resulted from these groups, that did not much matter, because their purpose didn't really extend beyond this. The basic problems didn't appear until individual rap groups exhausted the virtues of consciousness raising and decided they wanted to do something more specific. At this point, they usually floundered because most groups were unwilling to change their structure when they changed their task. That's the end of that quote. Freeman argued that for progress to be made in the women's liberation movement, it would have to jettison some of its preconceptions about organization. Quote, Contrary to what we would like to believe, there's no such thing as a structureless group. The idea becomes a smokescreen for the strong or the lucky to establish unquestioned hegemony over others. Thus, structurelessness becomes a way of masking power, and within the women's movement, it's usually most strongly advocated by those who are the most powerful, whether they are conscious of their power or not. End quote. Those who have power in structuralist groups often gain their informal position because of superficial factors such as appearing radical, coming from a background of race or class privilege, or having a particular lifestyle. Freeman, quote, those who do not fit into what already exists because of class, race, occupation, parental or marital status, or personality will inevitably be discouraged from trying to participate, end quote. To counteract this tendency, Freeman argues, any organization that hopes to be more than a discussion group must adopt some kind of explicit structure. Quote, the rules of decision-making must be open and available to everyone, and this can only happen if they're formalized. Next.
The alternative, Freeman argues, is horizontal hostility and internal conflict. Quote, infighting and personal power games rule the day, end quote. In contrast, when a group is involved in a task, people learn to get along with others as they are and to subsume dislikes for the sake of the larger goals, end quote. The endpoint of a structureless group is an inability to escalate beyond consciousness raising and a surrender to the iron law of involution. Quote, the women in the movement either turn in on themselves and their sisters or seek other alternatives of action. There are few alternatives available. Other women drift out of the movement entirely. End quote. The authors of the Resource Manual for a Living Revolution have a concise take on this topic. Quote, the elimination of authoritarian and hierarchical structures is important for democratizing groups, but does not mean the rejection of all structures. Groups that have taken the latter course have generally become ineffective, or else have reverted to the same, but no longer explicit, authoritarian leadership as before, end quote. 30 years later, writing in 2001, Barbara Epstein expressed similar concerns about the anti-globalization movement. She argues that it had followed a similar trajectory to prior movements like the one for nuclear disarmament. Quote, mass civil disobedience demonstrations became the signature of the movement, and an inability to move beyond this tactic became a liability. In each campaign, a point was reached at which the size of civil disobedience protests leveled off because the maximum number of people willing to be arrested on that issue had become involved. At this point, it would become clear that civil disobedience protests alone could not overturn the nuclear power industry or the arms race, end quote. Epstein argues that those campaigns ended not because they were successful, but because the nuclear arms race and nuclear power industry receded from public prominence for other reasons. She adds, quote, the current anti-globalization movement has roots in the nonviolent direct action movement, with which it shares a structure based on small autonomous groups, a practice of decision-making by consensus, and a style of protest that revolves around mass civil disobedience. Each of the major organizations of the nonviolent direct action movement began with great promise, but soon went into decline, in large part due to the structural and ideological rigidities associated with insistence on consensus decision-making and reluctance to acknowledge the existence of leadership within the movement. This raises a question for the anti-globalization movement. Will it share the fate of the nonviolent direct action movements of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, or will it gain the flexibility that will allow it to evolve with changing circumstances? End quote. Next. Logan?
It's clear her concerns were justified. While they helped to develop and sustain a culture of resistance, summit protests had a negligible effect on global government policy. And I say that as someone who did their share of summit hopping. Riot police have learned how to handle large, unorganized, spontaneous crowds very effectively while deploying whole new levels of crowd control technology from facial recognition cameras to drones. Now, nearly 2 decades after the battle in Seattle, their strategic and tactical advances have not been met by corresponding organizational progress on our side. In any case, Epstein believes that movements with a single-minded rejection of leadership will burn out when confronted with the practicalities of organizing. The moral absolutism of the anarchist approach to politics is difficult to sustain in the context of a social movement. Absolute internal equality is hard to sustain. Movements need leaders. Anti-leadership ideology cannot eliminate leaders, but it can lead a movement to deny that it has leaders, thus undermining democratic constraints on those who assume the roles of leadership, and also preventing the formation of vehicles for recruiting new leaders when the existing ones become too tired to continue. Okay, yeah, I was going to say. Of course, not all anarchists in history have taken this approach. When working class anarchists of the Spanish Civil War formed militias to fight Franco's fascists, they understood that an army needs officers if it is to go into battle. But they elected those officers and put limits on their privileges. Okay. Organizing has been a fundamental imperative of effective militants throughout history. It's said that the wobbly songwriter Joe Hill was about to be executed, that when he was about to be executed, he sent a parting telegraph to his friend Bill Haywood. Don't waste any time mourning, organize. So the rejection of structure is a dead end. And the structure and organization of a movement determines the kind of tactics it can use. Liberal mass movements were conducive to secrecy, and underground cells are terrible at mass mobilization. Their problem is that many groups decide to organize in a certain way because of their values and then try to decide what to do. We need organization, and the only question is, what kind? Organizational tensions. There is no right way to organize a movement or a resistance group. Effective organizations emerge from the complex interplay between many factors, goals and strategy, the culture and experience of the resistors, state repression, and the communications and logistical capacity available. For those reasons, it would be misleading to lay out universal rules for structuring a resistance movement. Instead, there are fundamental tensions that resistance groups must consider thoughtfully. For example, is a group better when it's small and trusted or large and sprawling? Is it better to be centrally planned and directed or to be totally participatory and include everyone in all decisions? Is it best to draw on a large pool of volunteers with equal status or to have a trained corps of professional, I don't know if it's corps or corps, of professional organizers? The answer to these questions depend on a movement's goals and culture. Groups that exist to educate and propagandize have very different organizational needs from those engaged in direct conflict. The answers also depend on history. There is no single correct way to organize, but there are organizational structures with very successful histories and others replete with failure. One starting point in a 1975 book by William Gamson called The Strategy of Social Protest. Despite the title, the book is really more about organization than strategy. Gamson, along with the graduate students and collaborators, did a systemic evaluation of social movements in the United States between 1800 and 1945. To make this project feasible, given the hundreds of different movements, they zeroed in on 53 representative movements. Next.
Gameson then evaluated whether a movement had achieved success based on its own goals and measured which characteristics were correlated with success. For example, were movements more likely to be successful if they were bureaucratic or informal? If they were pacifist or if they used violence? If they went through proper channels or if they were unruly troublemakers? This wide time frame leads to some unusual groups being included, like League of American Wheelmen, founded in 1880, who struggled for the legalization of bicycles. But the lessons matter. On the whole, the groups Gamson studied won at least partial success slightly more than half of the time. Some 38% achieved both political advantages and political acceptance. That is, they got what they were looking for and became recognized as legitimate advocates for their cause. Big text block here, groups, organizations, and movements. For clarity, let's define some of the terms we're using in this chapter. Group, highlighted or bolded out, I guess I should say, groups are collections of activists who organize or work together. Usually they work face to face and know each other. Groups may be short-living or long-lasting. And the next bolded out is going to be organizations. Tend to be larger, more formally structured, and often consist of multiple groups working together. Their structure helps determine how internal groups communicate, how decisions are made, how people are recruited and trained, and so on. Then the next bolded out is movement. A movement includes many overlapping organizations, groups, and individuals all working towards some roughly common goal of social, political, or economic change. Strong movements are diverse and can't quite read that last part. Strong movements are diverse and able to take collective action. And then we have a chart here for political acceptance on the left and new advantages on the top of the chart here. That is a really weird looking chart. 11% of the groups were preempted to use Gamson's terminology. They did not achieve political acceptance, but changes they sought were adopted by those in power. 9% were co-opted. They won a place in the political establishment, but failed to achieve their stated objectives. 42 failed on both counts, which Gamson called collapse. For a resistance movement, preemption can be a desirable outcome. Resistance movements do not seek to become a part of the dominant power structure because they do not view it as legitimate or just. It may be worthwhile to induce those in power to make changes while retaining independence. In contrast, co-optation is the worst outcome for resistors, worse even than total failure and collapse. A group that is co-opted not only fails to achieve its objectives, it is engulfed by the establishment and diverts resources and people into an organizational dead end. We can use Gamson's analysis along with other historical examples as a starting point for discussion and to illuminate organizational factors that can lead to success or failure. I'll talk about 7 different organizational tensions. Number 1, small versus big. 2, centralized versus decentralized. 3, formal versus informal. 4, consensus versus hierarchy. 5, clandestine versus open. 6, moderate versus militant. 7, anything goes versus code of conduct. Next.
So the first tension that we're looking at here is small versus big. Are resistance organizations more effective when they are large or when they are small? Piven and Cloward suggest in Poor People's Movements that a default goal on the left is to create large, bureaucratic, mass movement organizations. To build or support something like Greenpeace or the Sierra Club, massive and bureaucratically structured organizations which can contend with corporations and gain acceptance from the media and the government. The tone was wrong, but that's what it says. There are compelling reasons to form large organizations. A big organization can pool more resources and mobilize more people. It can have greater influence in elections, probably the main reason large organizations are favored on the left. Large organizations are often able to exert more physical, social, and economic force. That's important because exercising force is a main function of a resistance movement. But here are the problems, which are illustrated by Gamson's research. He found that group size had little impact on group success. That is, in general, groups of tens of thousands had not much more success than groups of tens or hundreds. Large groups were more likely to gain acceptance from their adversary, just as well-established unions gain the acceptance needed to negotiate contracts for workers with large employers. But larger groups were also more likely to be co-opted. This is a critical vulnerability of larger groups, and the major danger that Piven and Cloward argue against. When groups grow and want to recruit members as fast as possible, they lower the bar. That is, they don't demand that new members have the same strength and depth of political commitment as existing members. This may be fine if a group only wants participants to sign petitions and send donations, but it can cause politics of a radical group to become watered down, for their tactics to be limited to the lowest common denominator. The Mattachine Society shows how a group can grow too fast. The Mattachine Society did not start off as the timid organization it was in the days of Stonewall. It was founded around 1950 by Harry Hay, a gay political activist. Hay used his experience in the Communist Party to devise a pseudo-cell structure that could maintain secrecy within the society. Hay and the other original leaders of the Mattachine Society were radicals, and their attitude toward conformity was similar to that which later became gay pride. The society grew rapidly after its founding, and a convention was organized in 1953, but the convention did not go smoothly. An influx of new and more conservative members pushed out many of the original radical leaders, and remaining radicals left in disgust. The new president of the Mattachine Society, Ken Burns, abolished radical politics in favor of an individualistic approach, emphasizing personal change. He wrote, quote, "We must blame ourselves for our own plight. When will the homosexual ever realize that social reform, to be effective, must be preceded by personal reform?" Sorry, I couldn't not read that in a mocking voice. End quote. To abandon radical politics for personal change is a classic mistake and a dead end for any resistance movement. Activist Lionel Wright argues that this set gay progress back by 10 years. Quote, "The position of the new leadership was that gay people could not fight for changes in U.S. society, but had to look to respectable doctors, psychiatrists, etc., through whom to ingratiate themselves with the authorities in the hope of more favorable treatment," end quote. But those experts overwhelmingly argued that homosexual desire was a medical or psychiatric illness. The new emphasis on respectability prevented the Mattachine Society and its allies from using militant confrontation or pushing for radical change. You cannot cause a fuss, let alone a riot, if your main goal is to appear personally respectable to the establishment. And even this desire for respect did not allow the Mattachine Society to gain political acceptance. Next.
In the end, it was those who were respectable who were able to fight back. Oh, sorry. In the end, it was those who were not respectable who were able to fight back effectively. They were the ones who spawned real progress through actions like the Stonewall Uprising and by zapping, publicly confronting and disrupting. The same doctors and psychiatrists to which the leadership of the Mattachine Society had pointlessly supplicated themselves. After the civil rights movement and Stonewall, a growing number of activists rejected the ideas of conformity and accommodation in favor of pride and militancy. Wright explains, quote, "Eventually in both the Mattachine Society and a similar conservative lesbian group called the Daughters of Bilitis," I think I've heard that before, DOB, the leadership chose to dissolve the national structure rather than see the organization fall into the hands of radicals, end quote. Smaller branches continued to exist and were increasingly taken over by more militant organizers. I take this lesson from the trajectory of the Mattachine Society. Usually it is better to have a small group that can take militant action than a larger group that rejects militant action. Large groups have other challenges. The larger a group becomes, the harder it is to make participatory decisions. Only in small groups can everyone participate directly in discussions. Group trust can be diminished if people no longer work face to face. Security is another challenge. We'll come back to that shortly. Despite these challenges, there are compelling reasons for organization to grow and expand. Small and isolated resistance groups are easily overwhelmed and destroyed. Effective resistance movements, such as the Deacons for Defense, have understood this. As Lance Hill explains, quote, to win the hearts and minds of the mass movement, the deacons became organizational expansionists. Unlike precursors who were content with secret local organizing, the deacons aggressively sought to proliferate chapters across the South in order to create a powerful mutual defense network capable of standing up to the Klan. By building a regional alliance, they overcame the fear that blacks faced insurmountable odds. End quote. So it was for the industrial workers of the world, whose ultimate goal was one big union encompassing all workers, which would be able to stage a massive strike that would boot out the ruling class once and for all. The same applied to resistors in Vietnam, who spent more than a quarter century fighting to kick out the French, the Japanese, and the Americans successively. They succeeded each time because, as I'll discuss in the logistics chapter, they were able to mobilize almost every part of society for collective struggle. That same lesson was applied by successful anti-colonial struggles around the world. New gray box. Careful growth for radical groups. To try to maintain some benefits of small groups, radical movements that want to grow can, first bullet point, choose new members carefully, especially if they are to participate in decision-making and organizing work. 2, train new members well in both hard and soft skills so that they are integrated and enculturated into the organization. 3, be clear internally and with new recruits about what their group exists to do and why. 4, grow at an appropriate pace to ensure that suitable and trained recruits are available for important roles. 5, maintain smaller subgroups within a growing organization to maintain the social and organizational benefits of small face-to-face groups. In an underground group, these are compartmentalized cells. Above ground, they might be affinity groups. 6, manage sensitive information on a need-to-know basis, if appropriate, so security is not compromised by larger numbers. 7, maintain a core group, like an executive or a steering committee, that can maintain the necessary analysis and be granted the necessary information and time to make good decisions. End of gray box. The benefits of a larger organization or a larger movement containing multiple organizations are compelling. Fortunately, groups and movements can still grow and recruit without sacrificing all of the benefits of small groups we hold so dear. Next.
Logan.
Are resistance organizations more effective when they are centrally coordinated or when they are made up of decentralized small groups? Again, the answer depends on goals. A propaganda organization that distributes newspapers and leaflets might function well as a decentralized mass. An organization that is engaged in a prolonged conflict with those in power, in which people are taking major risks and need to take coordinated action, would have a very difficult time without any central coordination. Gamson's research finds as much. In his study, more centralized groups were much more likely to succeed. It's part of an organizational quality he calls combat readiness. A resistance movement, or any radical social movement, is in a struggle with those in power. It needs to be able to take coordinated action. It needs to be able to respond quickly and effectively to repression. It needs to be able to make timely decisions, and it needs to be able to hold itself together. One of the most dangerous things that can happen to a movement is factionalism. When a movement breaks into divided and competing fragments, a goal of COINTELPRO, and a quality of a culture of defeat, success becomes nearly impossible. Again, Gamson shows this clearly. He writes, internal division is a misery that few challenging groups escape completely. It is in the nature of the beast. Men and women of the best intentions, sharing common goals, will disagree on strategy and tactics. They will differ in the priorities they give to different sub goals, and in their emphasis on the pursuit of short range or long range solutions. In Gamson's research, groups that were able to maintain their integrity and cohesiveness had a relatively high success rate of 70%. Groups that were plagued by internal divisions almost always failed. Their success rate was only 22%. Centralization can be an effective tool for avoiding internal division. Some centralized planning and strategies essential for a movement engaged in a life or death conflict. And unity is required to successfully implement strategic and tactical goals. Unified groups can also pool their resources and develop better capacity for training, logistics, security, and the like. They can take on more numerous or more ambitious targets than smaller, disconnected groups and can use the coordinated, simultaneous actions that are so critical in asymmetric conflict. Centralized coordination can help prevent groups from strategically undermining each other. Groups must have effective ways to deal with internal disagreement. Centralization is one potential mechanism, but so is effective and participatory decision making. Together, these two comprise democratic centralism, an organizational form used by many successful movements. Many movements have tried to balance the benefits of centralization and decentralization through the use of federations, spoke councils, and other intermediate forms. Powerful democratic or participatory mechanisms are critical for maintaining grassroots groups and can help ensure that an organization isn't captured or run by only elites. But finding that balance can be complicated and fraught with difficulties. Next.
Let's spend a few moments looking at the industrial workers of the world, the IWW or the Wobblies, an important radical movement of the early 20th century. Founded in 1905 in Chicago, the IWW was both militant and politically radical. They were energized by their ties with both anarchism and socialism. Their fiery approach and willingness to strike won them many victories, and by 1917, they had over 150,000 members. A huge factor in their success was their desire to organize across existing fracture lines in the movement. Instead of organizing groups by their industry, their goal was to create one big union of all workers, regardless of craft, race, or gender. They believed that only by unifying the working class could the workers contend with the might of the capitalists. The IWW's formation and their organizing approach was partly a reaction to the more conservative American Federation of Labor, AFL. The Wobblies saw the AFL as both reformist because of its acceptance of capitalism and exclusionary because the AFL generally organized only white male skilled workers. While the IWW wanted to unify workers, they also wanted to avoid the kind of centralized labor organization they saw in the AFL. And so the IWW had a complicated relationship with centralization, and they didn't always handle it well. As Joseph Robert Conlon wrote in his book, Bread and Roses 2, Studies of the Wobblies, these issues arose virtually from the moment of inception. The founding convention adjourned amidst high spirits, but in fact, the IWW's first 3 years were dismal at best. Although the union fought a few small strikes immediately, the organization dissipated its energies internally in fractional struggles for control. The battles were fought with a bitterness that belied their lack of ideological content and bore little relationship to the meager prize at stake. Next.
Okay, so I'll probably be the last reader before we move on to the discussion portion. One early IWW member named William Z. Foster tried to turn the IWW into a syndicalist organization and then split from the group to form the Syndicalist League of North America. But instead of advocating for radical political action, writes Conlin, the Syndicalist League's quote, chief activity turned out to be the publication of several newspapers filled with anti-IWW, pro-AFL screeds. They damned the IWW as being democratic and statist and of socialist origin and taint, end quote. Foster's advocacy for the American Federation of Labor is baffling because the AFL hated radical communists, socialists, and anarcho-syndicalists alike. Foster was on the same side as the Wobblies in every politically measurable way. But so it goes when ego masquerades as politics and horizontal hostility becomes an institution. Revolutionaries, quote, revolutionaries, Conlin laments, and perhaps especially American radicals, have always seemed more enthusiastic in fighting one another than they have in allying to attack their common enemy, end quote. Even the relatively conservative AFL understood the importance of, at least the appearance of, solidarity. Around the same time William Foster was publishing his screeds, the president of the AFL made a public statement begging for unity in the public eye. Quote, "Let us, like a family, thrash out our differences within our own councils, and let us not carry our differences to the street, thereby adding to the pleasure of those who would oppose us," end quote. Another perspective comes from Stuart Bird. Dan Georgakis, I guess, Georgakis. Yeah, I guess it has to be Georgakis. Wow, that's a weird name. I'll just read that from the beginning. Another perspective comes from Stuart Bird, Dan Georgakis, and Deborah Schaefer, editors of Solidarity Forever, an oral history of the IWW. They write, the IWW halls and press were filled with criticism and debate, which generally seemed to strengthen rather than weaken the morale of activist members, end quote. There were frequent internal debates about tactics, tension between, quote, revolutionaries and reformers. The most fundamental schism was between those who, quote, urged the IWW to have a political arm and those who argued that the basic power of workers was at the point of production. The direct actionists believed that job control was the speediest route to the new society. The idea of capturing power at the ballot box, as urged by socialist allies, was not particularly attractive to them at a time when the majority of workers were barred from the polls, end quote. They added, quote, to place labor's hope on the ballot box seemed to select a field of combat where working class power was at its minimum, instead of concentrating on the point of production where its power was maximal, end quote. The Wobblies were a militant organization that relied on direct action, as Conlin writes. Quote, the IWW favored strikes. To a considerable degree, they too visualized each strike for immediate demand as a rehearsal, and perhaps even the immediate prelude, to the general strike, end quote. That is, a grand strike which would finally abolish capitalism. Effective political conflict requires both strategic planning and combat readiness. As Conlin explains, quote, one reason why the IWW favored centralization was so that the General Executive Board, presumably more knowledgeable of overall conditions, could temper hotheads in the locals who might commit the Union to a futile and injurious battle, end quote. We'll come back to the IWW in a few pages, but centralization is not the only way to keep an organization together. One important way to maximize cohesion is to build a shared culture. That's not just culture as film or literature, but the culture that is built through collective action and shared sacrifice. This has held many different movements together through difficult times. The Sandinistas of Nicaragua are a good example. At one point, they split into three feuding, quote-unquote, tendencies, which later reunited. Dora Maria Tellez, leader and a guerrilla commander during the liberation struggle, spoke to Margaret Randall about this in Sandino's Daughters. Quote, the split and the process of reuniting were difficult times for us, end quote, which is saying a lot given that their comrades were being captured and tortured. So I think we will stop there. Because, we only got like 2 minutes left in the reading portion. But yeah, that section already had a lot to discuss. I wonder what people have in mind that if did anything catch anybody's eye that they wanted to comment on in the reading there.
Well, I actually had a lot of thoughts.
I imagine there was a lot of details there, right? There was a lot
Yeah.
of stuff that I think might have been controversial among us, but also just kind of like general questions that people might have.
Well, I would say, because I really do have a lot of thoughts, I'll wait to say some of them later. But the first one is like the way they were using leaders was a very loaded term. Like they meant it in different ways in like almost every context they said it. By leaders, you couldn't tell if they meant people with like actual power in a movement to like carry out tasks, or somebody that was just like a figurehead or something. And then with Spain, it was more like they said it was a restriction of power, but really it was like they were delegated to certain committees with direct recall, and the power was still from the bottom of the base. So you're not like restricting power of any leader. They were delegated to certain tasks.
Yeah, I think that like one of the big challenges in this section, so like, we read the part about the tyranny of structurelessness, but then we also started this part where what he calls, like, what are they called? The organizational tensions. I think that's what he calls this section. But the tyranny of structuralness by itself was probably already enough for us to have a whole discussion group over. So it occurs to me here that, let's see, where she mentions, she mentioned anarchism at one point here. And it seems like to her, anarchism is structurelessness, and I think that's like a huge mistake here. And McBay does well to immediately kind of correct her quoted use of the word anarchism here, just to point out like the Spanish Civil War. But I also think that then the use, like you say, of the word leadership, it's kind of amorphous, Like I think here, let's see, the elimination, this is the authors of the Resource Manual for a Living Revolution. The elimination of authoritarian and hierarchical structures is important for democratizing groups, but does not mean the rejection of all structures. Groups that have taken the latter course have generally become ineffective, or else have reverted to the same, but no longer explicit, authoritarian leadership as before. And I think that's a pretty good summary. That's actually like what seems to be really going on. It's like, in this word leadership, right? So like leadership can take a lot of forms. And somebody in the chat, Long Defiant, actually said that when we were going over that section. He says, anyone who has studied and engaged in leadership knows that a hierarchical model isn't necessary. Leadership can be influence, reciprocity, modeling, or more. Leadership doesn't require dominance. And then Gibson optimistically responded, I like that insight. I might take it a step further and say that dominance is counterproductive to leadership. And Long Defiant says, yes, dominant leadership can actually be a hindrance. The followers might be constantly looking for permission, and the leader becomes a gatekeeper, which is not good. And I think that's kind of the idea here, like leadership is natural. There's just always going to be people who like commit super hard, who they're super determined to learn a lot, and always show up. And those people are kind of naturally going to take the position of leaders within the community, but that doesn't mean that they need to be given like some kind of formal power to command people. I think that's my real takeaway.
Yeah, something that this the tyranny of structurelessness reminded me of is that I used to be part of this organization that organized events. That it was an activist, and when I joined the organization team, I was like, okay, we're gonna like take decisions horizontally. There was like a hierarchical titles before, but we were still kind of organizing events and deciding for the rest of community with input. But one of the things that I wanted to do is to make clearer rules around safety, consent, and inclusion. And there was like a whole kind of hashtag Me Too element to the community I was in. So there was not that much pushback, but there's like a little bit of it. And a lot of people are like, these are just like, this is just common sense, you know? But I'm like, well, if it's common sense, why is it happening? And why isn't anyone doing anything to stop it? So we need these rules. So it's like another, not just a way to like structuralistness in that sense is just not just a way to hide power with like in the sense of leadership, but power, like oppressive power in the sense of like violations of consent that continue to stay unaddressed. Yeah.
I agree with that. I think that's one of what is her name? Joe Freeman. I think it's Joe. I think that's one of her best insights in the tyranny of structurelessness is that when you have structurelessness, you don't get rid of those like authoritarian or hierarchical relations. They are just informal, right? So like they may not have as much power, but they still have power, and they're just not able to be addressed because they're not legible. Also, I guess I should mention, I found it weird that he put in a sentence about democratic centralism out of nowhere. And
I had a complete thought on that too. That's what I was saying.
Okay. Well, you want to go ahead, Logan?
Well, it's kind of the same thing I was talking about with Spain, and also a lot of other times in the past. But it's like there should be power that derives from the mass of the group, and those given like the ability to do certain tasks have their scope, and it's not like they have power over them. They've just been empowered to do certain things. Like that's not what democratic centralism advocates. I don't know if it really is a mass movement, at least in which the masses have any control over it. It's not co-opted if there is a democratic centralist model.
Well, I found it weird because his description of democratic centralism does not match my study of democratic centralism, nor do I think that's what it looks like in practice. And I'm looking for it right now because I'm trying to figure out what he said. He was like, it was like democratic participation combined with centralization. It's like, yeah, I mean, participation in the sense that people get to kind of voice their opinions, but then the final decisions aren't made democratically. Like the people's decisions aren't binding on the leadership. The leadership gets to do whatever the fuck they want, basically. So they can do whatever they want. They just listen to the group. And then we would hope, or they might hope, that the leadership listens to the group, but the leadership does not have to listen to the group. Just like the head of the Politburo in the USSR didn't have to listen to the cabinet. They'd sit there and they'd debate, but they didn't have to actually do what they were told. They could do whatever the fuck they wanted. So it's weird that he characterizes centralization plus participatory decision-making as democratic centralism. That does not seem like a good description at all.
Well, what I understand from that sentence, which is right there, right? The second sentence in the middle paragraph, centralization is one potential mechanism to deal with internal disagreement, but so is effective and participatory decision-making. So it sounds like he's not equating the two. He's just saying, like, I guess if there's no effective participatory decision-making, then centralization is necessary. But I think, I don't know.
Well, he says together that they comprise democratic centralism.
Oh, sorry. Oh,
I would also say just another thought on centralism. It's like right above there, it says centralized coordination. And that's understandable. Having access to information over a broad base of people, all having access to something, they're all coordinating together. And then it talks about democratic centralism at the bottom, where that's something completely different. Also, like centralized planning and all that. But those are two different ways, at least in my mind, of centralization. I think that there are a lot of positive aspects of having a lot of information in one place, at least information that's supposed to be public within the organizations that wouldn't get them like compromised or something. But I don't know. Once again, if they see centralization as of coordination and of information sharing is the same as like a vanguard or something.
Yeah, it's kind of weird because like this in the last reading, this exact same thing happened when we got to this section. This was the section where there was the most confusion and like disagreement with Eric McBay. Like agreed that there is a tension between centralization and decentralization, but then it doesn't really seem to me like he is really providing a very good understanding of what centralization versus decentralization like means. You know, like he doesn't seem to really lay out a very robust conception of the difference between centralization and decentralization. You know, I would say, and I think kind of like towards what you're saying there, centralization of what? Centralization of decision making, centralization of meetings, centralization of action, centralization of information storage, centralization of what? Like it doesn't seem like, you know, see here, okay, so the very first sentence, when they are centrally coordinated or when they're made up of decentralized small groups. So it's like central coordination. Well, there's lots of methods that are between these two. This is, you know, federation is the way that you do decentralization with centralized coordination, right? I guess in his terminology. But like, this just doesn't seem like a very good understanding of the words centralized and decentralized. I'm a little bit confused. If he's giving us the description of democratic centralism, well, this is like centralized decision making, which is hierarchy. But then in another, then he has a different tension for hierarchy. He counterposes hierarchy to consensus. So, just like last time we read this, I'm profoundly confused by what the fuck he's talking about in this particular section.
Yeah, agreed. I do remember that debate as well. And I think maybe last time we read the whole section together. So like as in like all the different tensions. So we got to the hierarchy part and then we're like, well, yeah, like you said, centralized is hierarchy. I think he's definitely not using an anarchist definition of centralism, and that leads to a bunch of different confusion and a bunch of different definition of centrally, because like centrally, like you said, centrally coordinated, it's like federalism, but later he mentions the IWW, I think, that have a central executive committee that will temper the local hotheads that want to go too fast into, I'm not sure exactly what they're trying to temper. But yeah, so that sounds to me like top-down hierarchical decision-making. So it's not, well, I guess, like you're saying, like if participatory is just like you give your opinion, then I don't know, whatever. It's not meaningful, in my opinion. But also, yeah, democratic centralism, if we adopt the definition of democratic as in people decide, everyone has meaningful decision-making power, then that's an oxymoron. So yeah, this whole section is very confused and confusing indeed.
Sadly, I do think that this must come from Eric McBay's misunderstandings himself, right? I can't, like, this is now my second time, really, no, my third time reading through this. And I remember when I read through it the first time, I was like, okay, well, I'm going to read through this again with the study group. So like, I'm sure I'll understand it better when I read through it with other people. And then I didn't. And I was like, no, this is still just very confusing. What the fuck? Like these are really weird categories that seem to overlap. And now here I am on my third read, and I still I find this analysis very confusing. I think what I will say I think what Eric McBay's expertise is around is like movements, how movements are built, how people socially relate to one another, what successful and harmful behaviors are in masses of people. I think that's like where his expertise lies. But I think we really kind of see his lack of detailed understanding about organizational structure in this section. I don't think he has a very good understanding of organizational structure. And in my experience, this is the case for people who aren't anarchists. They don't spend nearly enough time understanding organizational structure and distribution of power. They don't really understand power and power structures in a general sense. So I think it kind of really shows itself here in these sections. It's not like this is like a useless analysis. Like I think that he's right to point out that these are tensions, and he's got like valuable things to say about each of these tensions. But I think that his analysis is very, as you said, confused and confusing. Yeah. What does everybody else think?
I guess I was just thinking about like that very first sentence for this section, right? Yeah, Logan made a great point in the chat, but no, that first sentence where he says it's either centrally coordinated or it's just decentralized small groups. So for him, that's what decentralized means, right? He's defining it there.
So like what I think is weird, even in the sentence, is that, okay, centrally coordinated, that is one way you can do things. You can coordinate centrally, but that, in my opinion, is not opposed to decentralized small groups. You can have.
Yeah, I feel like it's missing. Well, because if he's taking the Wobblies as the next example or something, then that would be, there's local chapters, but they're getting their commands from a central office. Is like that a difference enough?
Yeah, he gives that as an example of centralization.
Right.
Yeah, which, okay.
I guess I would just say that's all he's looking at for decentralization is decentralized small groups, which could include federations in a broader sense. But
well, I wonder if he would consider a federation to be centralization.
But they're decentralized small groups. So I feel like if it's small groups that are just associating with each other instead of like everyone knows they're a Wobbly, right? Like you're in the Wobbly, but you could be a part of some other group who's just federating with another small group, right?
Yeah.
I'm trying to find the sense of it, I guess.
Oh yeah, no, I hope you do. I want to know what the hell he's saying, to be honest.
I guess you're right though. I don't think the analysis is deep enough because he uses a lot of kind of cop out sentences like that's the Wobbly is the centralized example for sure.
It's weird though, because then he contrasts the IWW. A lot of
cop-out words like,
go ahead.
There's difficulties doing this, and which side could be more beneficial. So he's kind of playing the fence in a lot of sentences.
Yeah, I think he was kind of aware in writing this book that he was trying to make something that appealed to a lot of different tendencies. He was trying not to be a factionalist, as he says. Like he was trying to write something that's just useful to everybody. And so I think in various places he's not taking a line you know?
For sure.
And it should be said that if we're like over here trying to read his intentions into the work, like he gives a lot more positive lip service to an anarchist or horizontal approach than he does to democratic centralism, which gets literally one sentence, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But it is a weird mention. It kind of comes out of nowhere. Yeah, very peculiar. And then here, I think what confuses me even more is that it's like, okay, well, IWW is an example of centralization in his mind, where they use, you know, the total coordinated body in order to control the individual decisions of the chapters. But then he contrasts the IWW to the AFL because the AFL was more centralized. And then it's like, okay, well, could you give me an understanding of like what the contrast is? You know, like here, the IWW wanted to unify workers, but they also wanted to avoid the kind of centralized labor organization they saw in the AFL. And so the IWW had a complicated relationship with centralization. So then,
yeah, he's kind of towing the line in a lot of ways. So
yeah, I'm just not sure what. I guess I don't really understand how his analysis is helping us here. You know, it's like in this particular part, I love this book, but like this particular part, I'm just, what is he doing? I guess maybe, okay. Maybe I'm trying to understand. I'll try. So like centralization would be us all being in one organization, whereas decentralization would be a bunch of organizations working together. So the fact that the IWW is all one organization, instead of it being like 50 chapters, all with different names who form a federation, maybe that's what he's trying to get at here.
I really just think it's like a rage bait section. Or at least
You think it's? I don't think he's rage baiting. I don't.
It feels like rage bait.
Yeah, I think it is. You know, yeah, it's like the idea that everyone is part of this union. You know, that was the idea: get everyone on board with the union. So then the tactics would be the same, and then it's all centrally directed, or at least, you know, the rules are established, things like that.
Yeah, I guess, you know, would he consider Cooperation Tulsa centralized because it's all one organization?
I mean, we don't have like different chapters. I guess actually he would argue that there are multiple cooperations, maybe actually. They're not necessarily like federated, but there's 3 cooperations I know of, including us. So it wouldn't be all one cooperation, you know? We haven't branched out.
I think because they have decentralized names, it automatically makes it decentralized, right?
I guess.
No, what?
I don't know.
Well, it's like Cooperation Tulsa is Cooperation Oklahoma City, so like there's no inherent like idea that those two groups would be cooperating with each other, right? They just happen to share a name.
Yeah. Right. Well, but then like all the branches of different unions, even when they're part of a big union, have different names. Like the IWW has locals, and so does the AFL-CIO, and you know.
Yeah, it's not the same. Is that are they centrally coordinated by a different, like a top-down entity?
But then that seems like that's hierarchy, or I guess maybe that's us. That's us taking the anarchist understanding of hierarchy into this discussion. Maybe that's not. I think he uses it.
I think there's pretty set rules. Like if it's like the IBEW or whatever, then they just have like a chapter name that's more of like a number. So then to me, that again, like centralizes it, because then you're just another kind of faceless chapter. You know what I mean? Whereas like,
yeah.
Whereas you say Cooperation Tulsa, it's like that brings like a place to mind. So then like you don't necessarily have to be there to be involved, but it helps, right?
Yeah. Yeah, not sure, but I will say, we only got like 10 minutes left, but we've left behind the previous tension completely, and that was big versus small. I think that one was kind of interesting too, because one of the things he mentions in the big versus small part is that where is it? It was basically that big groups are not more likely to achieve their goals than small groups, which I thought was very surprising, but interesting.
Yeah, I feel like that's something that, people say a lot, like, that the, small groups are the things that do change the world. Big groups, I mean, yeah, to me, it's like you risk bringing in people that are, disruptors. They might actually have ill intent, things like that. So
Yeah.
smaller is better.
Smaller, yeah. I mean, I think I will say in this section, I think he nailed this tension, right? I don't think anything was incoherent in this part. This part was really actually pretty interesting, and I think he made a lot of good points. Like right here, the larger group becomes, the harder it is to make participatory decisions. True. Only in small groups can everyone participate directly in discussions. Group trust can be diminished if people no longer work face to face. Agreed. That's absolutely true. Despite the challenges, there are compelling reasons for organizations to grow and expand. One of them being that small and isolated resistance groups are easily overwhelmed and destroyed. And we've seen that plenty of times in history. And then, large groups are able to utilize collective action. They can act together in large numbers to get things done. They can have mass strikes and mass boycotts and mass marches and so on. But at the same time, as we said, they kind of are easier to co-opt, as he mentions here. So here he actually gives some to try to maintain benefits of small groups while you grow. Choose new members carefully, especially if they're participating in decisions and organizing work. I think Cooperation Tulsa definitely does that. We have like a whole vetting process. Train new members well in both hard and soft skills so that they're integrated and enculturated into the organization. We try our best. I think just having people come out to Flat Rock and work together is like a great way for us to develop a culture together. Be clear internally with new recruits about what their group exists to do and why. That's why it's good to have like an orientation. Grow at an appropriate pace to ensure that suitable and trained recruits are available for important roles. Yeah, we actually need to answer some applications. There's several people who've told me they've put in applications. We haven't responded. Maintain smaller subgroups within the growing organization to maintain social and organizational benefits. I don't think we're to that size, but absolutely, that's what working groups are all about. But yeah. So we only got like 5 minutes left. What are people's closing thoughts?
I think that there were some good insights occasionally in there, but largely this section, I think, missed the mark personally.
Yeah, I think the big versus small part was good, and the tyranny of structuralistness part was good, but that the centralized versus decentralized part was very confused.
Yeah, I like these readings. Looking forward to reading the next parts here and getting further into it.
Anybody else got any thoughts before we call to a close? All right. Well, yeah, I'm just reading back through the chat here, seeing what people have said. Somebody, Jojo said a little while back, it's my first time tuning in. I want to start an anarchist group in my area as there are currently none. Is this the right place to learn? I'd say, yeah, in a general sense. You should just in fact, just go back and watch through all of these the recorded live streams that we've done of this book. This book is going to give you a lot of great insights on how to organize a group of any kind, to be honest. And if you want to join us on the discussion, I guess I should mention this as we're coming to a close. If you want to join us in the discussion in the chat room, go over to our Open Collective and become a donor for any amount. I will put a link for you here. Just become a donor and then tell us when you have become a donor, and we'll give you a link to the Discord server for Cooperation Tulsa. And then you'll be able to see when we're doing not only the organizer education group, but also the popular education group. These take place on alternating Mondays, both of them at 7:30 p.m. Central Standard Time. So if you want to join us in these discussions rather than just watch, then you should go become a donor. Because we are definitely in fundraising mode as Cooperation Tulsa. Also, if you just want to learn more about what Cooperation Tulsa is doing, you should go watch my latest video, which is the year 2025 year in review for Cooperation Tulsa. I personally think it was a pretty good video, even though the algorithm doesn't agree. So I think that's about it. I appreciate everybody showing up, both on stream and here in chat. And I'll see y'all next time. Have a good one.
Have a good night, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.